Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com. Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome to the second of a two-part podcast from our recent webinar on IT governance for nonprofits. In Part 1, my guests Nora and Jeff gave us an overview of the most important IT policies to have and talked about the process to create or revise them. We shared some templates on our website, communityit.com, and did 2 polls to find out how many nonprofits in our audience had acceptable use policies and what their communication style was within their organizations. In Part 2, we talk about the implementation and rollout of new or revised policies, the barriers to starting this project, and we give some tips on keeping your policies up to date in the future. If you're having a little FOMO, I encourage you to join us live on a webinar and ask your own questions. You can see all the resources shared in the webinar in the transcript on our website, communityit.com. Welcome, everyone, to the Community IT webinar. This one is Making IT Governance Work for Your Nonprofit. My name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the Outreach Director for Community IT and the moderator today. And I'm very happy to hear from our guest speakers, Jeff Gibson from Build Consulting and Nora Aboki from Community IT.
Hi, I'm Jeff Gibson. I'm with Build Consulting.
Hi, I'm Nuruddin Aboki, Community IT Consultant.
So now we're going to move on to our next topic. How do you roll out policies to new and existing staff? So we had some ideas here. You can work with HR for new hires and performance review opportunities. So I think a lot of us are familiar with, you get the HR employee handbook on the first day or the first week of work, and it has the acceptable use policy in there and probably a bunch of other policies too, but whether or not you can absorb it at that time. So working with HR to make sure that those policies kind of are re-rolled out periodically. What's effective to roll out to existing staff, and are there tactics that work? So Nora, would you like to take the first try at this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Part of the rollout process is to initially get the stakeholders to agree on the implementation of the policy itself. Like we have agreed that we're going to do, for instance, an acceptable use policy. We've agreed on the final version. Now it's time to roll it out. Then having a launch plan is something that an organization should have in place. That launch plan will include the roles and outlining the roles and timetable. Also, this needs to be circulated to all the parties that are involved for agreement. Like the role players need to know, and the timetable to actually go for lunch. Then the one key important thing is to have a communication plan, because as you've seen that a variety of organizations have different modes of communicating with their staff and different channels. So usually an organization should use the appropriate channels, messaging, to make sure that everyone that is a part of this policy has received the policy or will be receiving the policy appropriately. And there needs to be also leadership involvement, since we agreed that the stakeholder participation should include leadership. So leading by example is going to be a key kind of way to get this rollout possible. Setting positive examples for employees to demonstrate compliance with the organization, IT practices or policy. Giving those examples will show, hey, this policy could work. I can see me, complying with this policy. Not just one way, the policy, here's the policy, follow it, but kind of having a conversation about how this policy is actually helping with the mission of the organization. And then setting milestones, to communicate the IT policy, and just to make sure people are not overwhelmed. So if you put a milestone, you can basically just track all those milestones in the plan. That way, it's not too many changes at once, and making sure each policy is rolled out timely, appropriately, making sure people have the bandwidth to receive it well, and also ask questions and provide feedback. That way, you can kind of measure the success of the IT rollout policy. I know that Jeff mentioned something about, kind of leveraging trends. You can, in a way, you want to have a protocol to ensure that, you're encouraging people to follow the compliance that is outlined in the IT policy. So if there is any new advancement in technology, you want to make sure that, after a review of the policy, you go back to your communication plan. You also think of examples that you can share so to motivate people, but maybe the adoption of a new AI, acceptable use policy, for instance. So that kind of continuous improvement and continuous review, it's going to be helpful in having the rollout be successful. I would add just two more points here. One is the explaining of the importance and the significance of the IT policy, because just making sure in the communication it's thoroughly explained that there is no chance for misinterpretation and the people understand what they are signing up for. And then lastly, I would say you want to make sure it's distributed, accessible. It's not buried in a handbook somewhere. People can have a section if you have an intranet. So many types of ways to distribute information, depending on the methods that you use. Make sure it's readily available, accessible, and kind of put it in as part of your commitment to ensuring that these IT policies are clearly kind of explained to staff, either in all staff meetings periodically or referenced at least once a year so people are aware. Because they easily can get forgotten because of other priorities that the organization may have. So those are kind of the steps that would kind of summarize. But there's more to this, but I'm just summarizing the rollout of IT policies.
Thank you. There was a great comment in the chat from Michelle, who says that with IT policy changes, we roll out to the operations team first because that team is the most tech savvy and the least change averse. So it seems like they get their champions, so the people that are going to be most excited and least frightened by the change first, and they help them work out the kinks. Once we worked out the kinks, we put together documentation and roll out to all staff. And then she says she also puts a couple of preemptive 15-minute meetings on the calendar for folks who need more assistance. So that's really, I think, smart and strategic to identify the people that will be the most resistant and give them that extra help to understand the new policy. And sometimes the new policy, really, you don't have to change anything. You have to know it, but you don't have to change what you're doing. But if there are changes that are going to happen, making sure that you give them that extra hand holding. Thank you, Michelle, for that comment. Jeff, do you have other examples of ways that you can roll this out? And is it different getting the attention of new staff and getting the attention of existing staff? Do you have different strategies?
I do. The one thing, back to an earlier point that was made, is calendaring the change. This is tough for organizations, but as much sway as you can have on HR to have a yearly review with all necessary people in that review of the employee handbook. And then the other thing I always want to consider at that level is are there discipline specific or subject matter expertise policies that need to be reviewed and sort of acknowledged that they were reviewed in terms of if you have a database administrator, that's a much more buttoned up policy adherence and data handling than your average staff member is. Does the financial department need to have more training, more in-depth training on, again, financial handling, vendor management, et cetera? the policies page on an intranet is a great idea because it's all in one place. You can set a reminder to review that, and everybody knows sort of you get folks in the habit of going there. And then especially for new employees, when you're that first couple of days, you don't remember much from that first couple of days. So it's a place for your new employees to refer to, and they know they can look at it at when they have a chance to take a breath. The one thing that I don't know how widely known it is, it's fairly common, is if you have an HRIS system or your cyber provider may have plugins for training on certain policies. And then you can also end up negotiating. If I get 90% of my staff to review this CBT with successful passage of it, can I get some money knocked off of my cyber insurance? I've used that several times to where they'll, if they know your staff is well trained and there are policies in place, they will give you a reduction. They won't. I'm not guaranteeing it, but at least it's just a place to start negotiating. And then that CBT, if it's CBT based, you can also focus even deeper on maybe some folks didn't do well on the CBTs. They scored under an acceptable margin. Then that's the time to target them for focused in-person training or one-on-one training, because these folks are usually in critical roles, and some of these processes and policies require 100% compliance for the success of the organization.
Can you just remind us what is CBT?
Oh, sorry, computer-based training.
Okay.
Computer-based training. Yeah, a lot of organizations will have something in their HR management system that will, or an outside third-party vendor can come in and it's a subscription, and you can kind of dictate what trainings you want. And they have canned trainings, and they have
or adaptive.
And ones that you can customize, and they're usually not, they're fairly affordable. I know money's tight everywhere, but it's a really good way to get a handle on your overall organization with some data behind it, and lets you target where you need to train or communicate better, or what departments need more specialized training.
I want to get to the barriers and make sure we have a little time to talk about this, because I feel like we've touched on some of the barriers over the course of this presentation. But Nora, would you like to talk about some of the biggest barriers to creating these governance policies?
Yeah, sure. So one of the main ones we've seen is prioritization. So oftentimes an organization, especially nonprofit organizations, are focused on their mission, and they just want to achieve their mission, and that takes priority over IT. Spending the resources and time on IT governance or IT policies. Another aspect of this is just the lack of resources, or limited resources, if we will. Many nonprofits kind of operate with limited resources, which can make it difficult to allocate sufficient time and personnel to IT policy development. Also, which some may have a different mindset altogether, where nonprofits often focus almost exclusively on the mission and goals, which can lead to IT being overlooked and undervalued. So those are some of the, I would say, factors. But there are ways to overcome these barriers. But I want to hear from Jeff if there are more barriers that Jeff might have seen.
Mine largely are they're the exact same. Garnering that leadership buy-in and that communication of leadership buy-in. Buy-in is one thing. Having your leadership communicate to the general staff is another. And then the time, and that's I wish I had a magical response to the time thing, but it has to be, harkening back to what we were saying earlier, you have to prioritize based on the urgent needs of the organization, and there will be times where you have to have difficult conversations with leadership and department leads and other staff that we just can't do X right now because this new situation caused us to refocus. And another thing is, when you're communicating things like that, it's important to set a time frame and to stick to that time frame. Most folks will give you some grace if you have a date attached to something. Saying we'll get back to you, or having again IT, the famous black box of information, that we have to change that perspective. And then one of the things that I learned every time I had a different assignment or a different job, is you have to break out of the IT barrier. We'll call you if something horrible happens. Otherwise, you don't need to talk to us. We won't bother you. But IT has to be an outward facing organization and a communicative organization at that. And really speaking to, and again, these are all difficult things to do. I'm not trying to gloss over them. But, really speaking to users for their respective concerns, and what you're doing as an IT organization will help them, ease their job, secure their job, improve the success rate of whatever the discipline they're executing on. IT just generally has to get outside of being looked at as the plumber. IT has to be looked at as an enabler. And especially given how invasive technology has become, even in the last 10 years, much less 5 years, there's not many organizations or groups within an organization that aren't impacted by IT, and they have to be told, they have to be informed in how to use that IT to enable and better their mission, but also sort of the risks that are associated with these new, very powerful tools. AI is a perfect example, and the timing is critical. It's much harder to much harder to limit usage to non-IT teams of a new tool if it's already on their PC. You need to have that just-in-time sort of approach of policy training. Get the policy there before the tool is sitting on, the finance guy's desk who is playing around with AI, and he has no idea if it's a public LLM or a private one or whatever, or the risk to the organization is associated with just putting organizational IP out into the greater model. Again, they're tried and true, but and some of it's just diligence, is sticking with leadership, explaining to them on their level, and explaining risks of not refocusing the rest of the staff on behaviors.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say, I think you hit on something that I hadn't really thought about before, about IT being outward and making connections, some departments or teams that wouldn't necessarily think they had an IT interest. Like one example is that the HR people, who might have their own systems that are pretty walled off usually from everybody else's, but involving them in, if there's a performance review, helping the person in that review, like explain that they understand the acceptable use policies or the new AI policy or whatever it is that has changed, and get their buy-in and collaboration. That's a really interesting tactic. We had someone in the question also ask about being able to convey the risk to leadership. So if it's something that's going along and not prioritized because it isn't seen as a huge risk, and being able to communicate that to them, which is something IT often can do, especially if they're working on the cybersecurity aspect. So I want to go ahead and move into the Q&A session. We have a couple of questions here in the Q&A. So one question is, where do we check for compliance? For me, I was thinking something you said earlier, Nura, about you have a policy, and then are the people who are under that policy complying with the policy? So if your policy is you can't use ChatGPT, how do you know that people are, and how do you manage those expectations? Do you guys have some examples or ideas?
What comes to mind are tools. There are certain security controls or technical tools that would allow for enforcement of policies. So because we're vendor agnostic, if you have an email system, you have files in the cloud, some of the cloud providers will have a governance tool, for instance, that will say that setting classification for document sensitivity, confidentiality, and a certain group of people your organization should only have access. If someone tries to delete or copy a file from one section of the file system to another, perhaps that could be a violation. Tools that are monitoring the devices that people have or have been assigned, whether they're installing third-party applications, or even some of those tools prevent from the installation of third-party applications, and even changing the configuration of the device that is issued to a staff. So there are tools that allow for the enforcement of these policies that may help with compliance tracking. And I think having the policy is one thing, and enforcement is another challenge. But at least having a policy is a good start for your organization.
Especially at nonprofits, because we're very friendly, team-oriented. It can be difficult to lay down the law, basically. We have another question here about, would an IT disaster response policy normally be part of a larger organizational DR policy? Jeff, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. It's integral. I mean, it's outside of when I've done them in the past. I mean, outside of communication, ensuring, quick, fast enablement of communication from the organization to the outside world, the DR piece is critical. I mean, what's not in your, I mean, you can't pay your people anymore. You can't, you can't find your files anymore. You can't. So I think I would almost argue that DR, controversial, but DR from an IT perspective is becoming equally as important as the rest of the organization. An organization can shut down for a day or two. If an organization loses all of its data, you're starting from scratch. If an organization can't pay its people, you're really starting from scratch, and you're going to have a myriad of other issues that are going to result from that. But absolutely.
And DR, just to clarify.
I'm sorry, I'm doing it again. Disaster recovery.
Disaster recovery. And it could be a non-hacking disaster. It could be a flood in your office that, wipes out. Although with everything in the cloud, it's less likely. Although it could be, the systems are down on the East Coast for 24 hours or what have you. So
plus, there is still, sorry to interrupt, there are still a frightening number of especially nonprofits that just don't have the ability to finance a move to the cloud. I see a lot of on-prem systems still. A lot of, data on, backed up data on, large terabyte drives, things like that. It's still out there. So I think it's just a matter of, you can have a DR policy and a DR mitigation plan on a budget. It's just a matter, I mean, thinking it through, even if you have nothing to spend, thinking it through and doing tabletop exercises, making sure documentation is available offline. I mean, it calls back to the old days, but that big 3-ring binder with up-to-date information, that's always going to be sitting there. You might not have access to a knowledge base that you've crafted over the decade. But a lot of the old school stuff is still out there, and it's just hard, with the cost of cloud and the cost of some of the AI tools that enable a lot of the DR stuff.
We did a webinar on cyber liability insurance a couple of years ago. That's still all very valid and still appropriate. And one of the things that our guest said was to have just the phone numbers of your insurance provider and the police, because if you did suffer a malware or an encrypted, it had encrypted everything, and she had a client where the number to call the insurance provider was encrypted. They couldn't get it. So it was, very difficult for her. And she said, just that old school, a piece of paper that has those important phone numbers on it is important.
One thing to tap into, is just that your insurance providers can help and will help you create disaster recovery policies, usually included as part of the cost of your coverage. They don't want you to have a cyber incident either. It's much more expensive for them. So, they'll hook you up with auditors, resources at their disposal that won't cost you anything. And that can really help you kind of point out the weakest parts of your plan or your organization. So don't leverage those.
Exactly. We've done a couple of webinars. You can find them on our site about disaster response and how to create those plans. And as you said, Jeff, it doesn't have to be a very expensive exercise. It can be just your leadership team, figuring out who's going to do what in the event that something is inaccessible. So I'm going to leave with our last quick question. I want you each to tell me one thing that you would say to convince the board of a nonprofit of the importance of policies. So who wants to go first? And you can only say one thing. What's the most important thing to be convincing?
I mean, it's easy, but it literally can impact the continuation of the organization. I mean, the business it is a business continuity concern. You're not overstating it when you say, this could be the end of it from a financial or a data perspective.
Yeah. Nora?
I agree with Jeff, and I would add that the reputation of your organization is at stake. So having good technology policies protect your organization's data and reputation by providing clear guidance on what is acceptable, and how to manage risky situations.
Well, and I want to jump in and say that both of you are available to take more questions. So you can get in touch with both of us through our websites, buildconsulting.com for Jeff and communityit.com for Nura or myself. So I wanted to go back over our learning objectives. I hope that after this presentation, you understand the essential IT policy documentation for nonprofits and how to prioritize. We have a bunch of priorities, right? We have the acceptable use policy, and then also this disaster recovery and data retention necessities. That we hope that you have learned how to create or update these IT policies. And we shared some templates. I shared the link to our website where you have a bunch of other links to templates that you can use. Learn tactics and strategies to roll out policies to all staff. I want to thank both of our experts for sharing your experience and anecdotes and ideas on that. As you said, it's not easy. So don't worry that you haven't been able to do it, but hopefully we gave you some ideas to try. I love all of the information in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And then, of course, understanding the barriers to implementing IT governance and how to overcome those barriers. I think when we were talking about this presentation, one thing we kept coming back to was people's emotional response to the idea that they have to do this project, right? You might have an intellectual understanding that this could be the end of your nonprofit, that the risks are very real, and that you need to have these policies in place. But if you put an hour aside and you start working on it, and either you can't find your old policy, you can't find a good template, it just seems overwhelming. And you say to yourself, well, I'm not going to do that then, even though I know that I need to. So trying to overcome those kind of emotional responses and just make small changes, make it into smaller tasks that you can do that are going to lead up to your big accomplishment. I love your idea, Jeff, of putting stuff on the calendar, making time and just setting reminders. And then in the future, once you've got your policies, setting those reminders so they don't get out of control and out of date again. So just annually, quarterly, whatever works for your organization, putting that reminder on your calendar, setting those meetings and bringing the stakeholders back together, your leadership, to just revise them. It's so much easier to revise it and just say, oh, no, nothing's changed. We're good for another, quarter. Or, this AI is really growing and we need to incorporate that. So let's change a couple of these other things. So I think those are all such good pieces of advice. So thank you so much for all of that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We know you have a lot of other things that you want to be doing. Again, check back on the transcript. If we didn't get to your question, I'm going to append some of those onto our transcript, which will be up on the website in about a week. And Nura and Jeff, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.